Jessica is an award-winning journalist and critic who writes on gender, sexuality, and culture for the New York Times. She's covered sexual assault on campus, spent time with Hillary Clinton's childhood friends, and was the first journalist to profile Monica Lewinsky in a decade. She also writes a regular column on digital language. Jessica's first book, Feminist Fight Club, a survival manual for a sexist workplace, has been hailed as the millennial lean-in by the New York Times and a must-read by The Guardian. And yes, she's in a real-life fight club. We're going to get started with a quick video.
I'm glad he brought up millennials. Our total marketing reach with millennials has gone up about 60%. Our overall website visits have also been up about 17%. The way that we can actually change things.
Did you get my email from Thursday?
Focus.
Did you guys read that email? I think that our primary objective here is
changing initiatives.
next quarter.
Fight!
Our total marketing reach grew by 15%. Overall website visits went up 7%. And organic search traffic
about investing in strategy,
especially
and using
within
our
the team demo, which is really our core demo. We need to focus on our creative development. That's what mainly brought our total marketing reach up by 16% last year.
Good point, Amanda.
Thank you.
You know that our goals for Q4 are about the roadmap and the diversity and the progress of our company. Our company, if it's about anything, we really represent #progress. It's really where we draw our core values. Brittany, do you mind taking notes on this so we get everything down?
Oh, you know who's really great at taking notes is Josh.
Wait, what?
Fatality.
Hey, PJ, we need to talk about the quarterly sales report. Your team is down about 60% from last quarter.
Yeah, just give me like 1 second, okay.
Guys.
Got nailed right in the balls.
Bro, that was hilarious.
PJ, this is a huge deal. I have to take this as CEO. I need to understand, like, what happened.
Whoa. You need to chillax a little bit. You're freaking us out. You're acting kind of insane. I think it's that time of the month.
Fight!
If you're talking about the time of the month when I do your performance review, then you're right, and you're screwed.
Finish him! Victory!
Hey guys, this is Stephanie. She's the newest member of our team.
Hi.
Hey Stephanie, how's it going?
Good, nice to meet you.
Get a load of this chick.
Fight!
What is this woman staring at?
It's like if Ann Taylor didn't try.
What is her problem?
I'm the female on the team.
Ugh.
Is she replacing me?
You should be threatened by me.
I love her suit, just kidding.
Watch out, eyebrows. Hi. I'm Stephanie.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
It can kind of be a sausage fest in here, so I'm really happy to have another woman in the room.
Thanks.
Flawless victory.
Yes! Feminism! B? That was fucking hard.
Can you give us a backstory on what led you to write Feminist Fight Club, and also how you came up with all the amazing nomenclature in the book?
I really like puns, as you will see. So as Melissa mentioned in my very long, maybe too long bio, I'm in a real-life feminist fight club. And a number of the women are in the video, but it's essentially a group of creatives. We are journalists and writers and comics. And we began meeting about a decade ago when we were just starting our careers. We're all in New York City. And most of us were in very white male-dominated fields. And we were struggling. We were frustrated. We didn't know what we could be doing better to get ahead. We often questioned whether what we were experiencing was actually sexism or something more individual or personal. And so we would gather about once a month in one of our members' parents' houses because we couldn't fit that many people in any of our tiny studio apartments. And we would just talk about what was going on for us at work and try to provide support and offer each other advice on how we might try to combat some of the issues. So the Feminist Fight Club was real. And back then, the first rule of the Fight Club was, like in real Fight Club, that you didn't talk about the club. And that was funny, but also for real reasons, which were that a lot of the women in the group who were working at media outlets and different organizations did fear that if word got out that they were in what was essentially a feminist consciousness-raising group, they would be either stigmatized or potentially penalized. And so we didn't talk about the club. But lo and behold, here I am. So the rules have changed. And now the first rule of the Fight Club is you must talk about the Fight Club.
Love it. So at the beginning of the book, you kind of admit that the tone of the book is really light, and it's very friendly and casual. There are a lot of swear words. So I'm just wondering, and that's not to say that it's lacking in data or substance or seriousness of subject. So why did you decide to write in this tone?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it sort of is my tone. Like, I can't speak without swearing, apparently. And as a journalist, I've sort of come up on the internet. So I wanted to speak to young people in their language, which is also my language. And I felt like, I'd been working on and writing about these issues for a number of years, but I often was focused on the problem, not on the solution. And throughout my work with Lean In and other outlets, I always end up reading all of these academic studies that buried somewhere in the, page 19, there's like some little fight move or solution for how to combat a man-interrupter or a mansplainer. But it's not used in that language. And so I kept thinking to myself, like, if there was some way to just pull this stuff out and put it into a format that was fun to read and digestible, but also really practical and rooted in research, then it would provide a service that, frankly, I wish I had when I was starting my career. And so, I hope that there's something in this book for everyone, but I wanted to speak in a language that was light and, sexism is not a fun topic, but it can be fun to read about.
So speaking about those tactics, those are sort of more of those individual or personal tactics versus policy or institutional changes. Why did you decide to focus on those individual level tactics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately, dealing with gender equity needs to come from every level. So it needs to happen on a policy standpoint, though currently in our leadership in this country, I'm not very optimistic that that's going to happen. It needs to come from a business and a company standpoint. But I also think that I have felt in my career for many years that I was frustrated and I didn't want to wait around for HR policies or legal policies or politics to solve these problems for me. Not to mention that a lot of the forms of sexism we face today can't actually be prosecuted in court or legalized for. So what do? Well, there are actually ways that we can fight back against some of this stuff in our everyday lives. And it doesn't have to feel overwhelming. Some of these are small things, but we can do it on behalf of ourselves and we can do it on behalf of our fellow women. And so I wanted something that felt like I had agency, that would allow me to engage and try to work towards a larger, more equal world and more equal workplace that I could do every day.
Yep.
And so I certainly recognize the need for policy change and change from a corporate level, but like if you feel overwhelmed in your daily environment and you're constantly being interrupted when you speak, like there are things you can do to solve that.
So I want to talk a little bit more about those forms of sexism that you talk about a lot in the book. You call it death by 1,000 cuts type of sexism. It's the insidious, casual, politically correct, even friendly sexism or racism that people experience. And that is in contrast with an overt, clear-cut discrimination, like you said, that has a legal definition. So why is this kind of subtle sexism so much harder to report, so much harder to fix, and so much easier to dismiss?
I think because often we've internalized it in a lot of ways. I know this is Silicon Valley. We talk about unconscious bias a lot here. I probably don't need to define that for the people in this room, but you know, once upon a time, sexism was very overt. And so I began my career at Newsweek as a young writer. And while I was there, I started facing things like pitching an idea and having it be turned down, and then seeing it appear on the pages of the magazine under a man's byline a few weeks later. Or feeling uncomfortable speaking up in very white male-dominated meetings. Or feeling like if I negotiated for more money after finding out that a man with the same job title and description was making thousands of dollars more than me, that I would be perceived as pushy or wanting too much. So it's these subtle things, whereas the generation prior, while I was at Newsweek, I found out about the women who had actually sued that company for gender discrimination in the year 1970. There's an Amazon series now about these women called The Good Girls Revolt. But at the time, this was the first case of its kind. And women who worked at Newsweek were told, yes, you will be hired, you can do all of the job duties that a man can, but you're not allowed to write. We don't allow women to have bylines. And so at the end of the day, they would hand over their notes and probably a cup of coffee as well to a man who would get the credit. And they sued, and they were able to sue because it was clear that this was discrimination. They were saying outwardly that women are not allowed to write here and men are. And so this prompted lawsuits at the New York Times and Time Magazine and Sports Illustrated. Like, these women paved the way for female journalists. And yet 40 years later, here I was a writer, I had the title to prove it, and yet I was still facing some of these subtle things on a daily basis that, frankly, like HR policies can't really solve for.
Right.
Like, if you're the default note taker in a meeting, or you're constantly being interrupted, or you're perceived as bitchy or bossy when you make a command, when that is what is expected ultimately of leaders, what's HR going to do about it? You know,
Right.
like some of this stuff is internalized, and for what it's worth, it's not just internalized sexism that men possess, it's women as well.
Yep. You include a ton of data in the book to back up the type of sexism and discrimination that you talk about. So what sort of practical advice would you give to someone who wants to start sharing this type of data with their teams to, you know, educate and empower them with what we have after reading the book without coming off, you know, in that way?
Yeah, totally. Which we'll just point out, like, it sucks that we have to worry about
Right.
that, and we shouldn't have to. So lucky for you, there is a book. It's for sale in the back, and you can just like leave it underneath bosses' doors, put one in the ladies' room, put one in the men's room, like whatever. You can tear pages out of it, like do your thing. And then you can blame it on me. So it doesn't have to be you. No, but actually there is research showing that if you can present an idea on behalf of the group rather than on behalf of yourself, it's more likely to be accepted or taken in a way that, you know, doesn't leave you feeling like you're being too demanding. So I literally tell people to like print out studies and bring them up in whatever the scenario is. So, okay, women are actually more likely to be interrupted than men. Twice as likely, and more so if they're a woman of color. Obviously, in workplaces where meetings are such a huge part of it, and ideas are such a huge part of it, if you're being interrupted every time you speak, you're not contributing ideas, and you're not ultimately getting credit. So, okay, how do you stop that? Well, you can like tell someone to shut up when they interrupt you. I can tell someone that I want to hear what you have to say when you're being interrupted so that it doesn't make you look like the bad guy. Bad guy, I guess guy is a gender term, the bad person.
Folk, yeah.
But also, if you wanted to casually bring up that women, in fact, data shows are twice as likely to be interrupted as men, like there's a study you can print out and there's a footnote in the back of the book to do that. And then it's putting it on data and research, not on you being like too emotional or touchy and offended by a certain behavior. So I say like whenever you can blame something on the data, it's actually really effective. And part of the reason why the book is so reliant on it, in addition to me not liking to just give personal advice, because I'm a journalist and I'm trained to not do that, but it means that you can always refer back to like a Harvard Business Review study that can't be argued with. Like these are all things we should do because they're the right thing to do, but it can be hard to tell people that this is the right thing to do. So you can tell them that they should do it because it's actually better for business, and companies with more gender equality have higher returns, they're more profitable, more collaborative. And so there's all of these really data-driven reasons why it makes sense.
So in one of your previous comments, you mentioned unconscious bias, and unconscious bias training has seemingly taken over Silicon Valley. Can you share some of your thoughts on implicit bias and what it means to A, become aware of it, and B, go through a training program to address it?
Yeah, so for what it's worth, I think it was MIT has a implicit bias test where you can take it and see if you're biased. And I too am biased. So I think it's very important to talk about this, and the fact that implicit bias is a word that's being tossed around now and people know what it means. It allows us to recognize that we all have it. Yeah. And I think that recognizing that we all have it is the first step toward overcoming it. I think that some of the problems with some of these training programs is that they don't necessarily offer solutions. Mm-hmm. And so I think while the first step and the very important step is recognizing that we have bias and being able to notice it or check for it in the moment, we have to also think about changing our behavior. And so in the moment when you notice it, like, what can you do to stop yourself, or how can you point out when someone else is exhibiting bias? And for what it's worth, I was in a meeting recently, and a man and a woman walked in, and I caught myself in a moment of bias, assuming that the woman was the assistant to the man. And in fact, she was his boss. And this is like, I wrote a whole book about this. I talk about these issues all the time, but it's like, our brain takes these cognitive shortcuts that we have internalized over, literally thousands and thousands of years of us being taught that it is white men in charge and women who are supporting that. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like if I have it, we all have it. And so I think it's really important to talk about it. And I think that there's no downside to these training programs, but I also think that especially here in Silicon Valley, the idea of diversity and inclusion and bias trainings, these are words that are tossed around a lot, and we can't just talk about them, we need to also have action associated.
Absolutely, yeah, because only talking about them and learning about them tends to normalize them, and then nothing gets done as a result. So on the cover, there's an asterisk note for men. So what is your message for men?
So for those that don't have the cover in front of them, there's a little asterisk right here, and then it says, book is 21% more expensive for men. It's not really, that would be illegal. And actually it should now be 20% because we gained a penny, yay, in the wage gap. No, my message for men is ultimately that we need you, and we cannot fight for equality without men by our side. They are so important to this battle. And yet I try to use humor as a way into some of these issues. And so the 21% is supposed to be a joke, haha. And in fact, I've seen it be effective in the sense that I've seen men perusing the book and then seeing that asterisk and sort of chuckling and then opening it up. So hopefully that's a way in, and I try to use humor as a way to talk about really tricky issues. This stuff is hard, and sometimes it's really uncomfortable. And I think that sometimes men understandably feel uncomfortable engaging on these topics or knowing how to be an ally.
Yep.
And so I think it's so important to include them in the conversation and let them know, and not just men, but women too, that like we are actually going to screw up sometimes. Like we're not going to be perfect talking about this stuff all the time, but like with a commitment to be better, then we can screw up and correct for it. And at the end of the day, like, men are half the population. We cannot achieve equality without their support.
Absolutely. So speaking on the topic of inclusion, I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality, and just sort of get your view on intersectionality and how it maybe has, changed or evolved, especially in our current climate.
Yeah, so intersectionality, for those who don't know, the concept that feminism must be intersectional. It must also look at the cross-section, the intersection of race, of class, of gender identity, of sexuality. And that really, feminism is not feminism if it's not intersectional. And that's certainly my belief. This stuff needs to be incorporated and we need to be thinking about it all the time. I think that traditionally the mainstream women's movement, at least the public part that you learn about in history books or you read about in the press, has not done a great job of taking intersectionality into account. Like primarily the 1970s movement of women's liberation was white. And there were all sorts of really amazing subgroups, women of color, that were also rising up, but they just weren't talked about as much. Right. So I do think that right now what we're seeing is a much more intersectional view of all of this. Like this is something that we're talking about regularly. Mainstream publications that don't assume any knowledge of feminism are using that word, intersectionality. The New York Times recently did it, which was like a great thing for them, I think. And it's also important that some of the new emerging leaders we're seeing talking about this, the women of the Women's March, are of every race. And so I think that it's so important because I think that ultimately, like, you can't be a feminist if you don't also care about these issues. Like, feminism is intersectional.
So I want to talk about one of the pitfalls that you mentioned in the book that really affects me. So I can say I am an ever faithful, and that means that I want to believe that everything is fair, that career and the workplace is a meritocracy. So what advice would you give for people like me who still want to believe in a meritocracy and behave as if we, exist in one, despite all the research that disproves that?
I would say that loyalty does not pay the bills. And I think that as women, we too often put our heads down and do good work and expect to be recognized for it. And that's not our fault. Like, typically, it is harder for women to self-promote and call attention to the good work that they're doing because when we do, we're perceived as too braggy or we're disliked for it. And so we sort of internalize these structures that have told us over, years and years and years that we're supposed to be modest. Yep. And so, yes, I would like to believe it's a meritocracy too, but I think that I'm too cynical for that. And so any moment you can take to call attention to your accomplishments is not a bad thing. And if you feel uncomfortable doing it, enlist someone else. There's a term I have in the book called a boast bitch. And this is a person who brags on your behalf. And there's a real reason for this. It's because women are disliked when they brag about themselves. But of course, like, we're working in competitive office environments. We need to draw attention to the work that we do. Yep. So, like, you and I are boast bitches. We have an unspoken or a spoken agreement. I boast for you, you boast for me. Like, every time you do something great, I send an email to our entire team and CC you on it. And then you can look completely humble. I'm going to look like a great colleague, and everyone gets credit. So, meritocracy, like, yes, it would be great if that existed, but I think that the numbers show us otherwise.
I think we need to create a marketplace at Google for boast bitches. You can sign up to be one.
If people are uncomfortable with the word bitch, you can call it like a boast bae, whatever. And for what it's worth, bitch, in the sense that I mean it, boast bitch can be a man or a woman. Like, anyone can be a boast bitch. It's just someone who has your back.
Awesome. Another of the chapters that I thought was really powerful was the one on negotiation. And I especially loved the piece of advice is to view your ask in shades of gray, not black and white. Can you share your point of view on negotiation and how women and men approach negotiation differently and therefore get different results?
There's a lot of research around the issue of negotiation. And what the newer research is finding is that women who do negotiate are often viewed as aggressive or pushy, and it makes them less likely to actually get the raise. So, all right, like, well, how are you supposed to overcome that? Like, there's no real solution to that other than, like, keep asking, and it will become normalized, and then we won't view a woman who asks as pushy or aggressive. Yeah. But in addition to that, women are often less likely to ask. And so I know that when I was starting my career, I never asked. I felt so incredibly lucky to have a job. This was when I was at Newsweek in the early 2000s, and like journalism was imploding everywhere. So I was in a way lucky to be employed, but it caused me to not ask. And it wasn't until I realized this other guy who I worked with the same title was making many thousands of dollars more than me that I was like, okay, I have to go in and ask. Yep. And so what I did is I tried to be very data-driven about it. Like, I didn't want to go in and tell them that I felt I deserved it or that I needed to pay off my student loans. I wanted to come in with a list of statistics about the work that I'd done. So, like, I added up every possible conceivable statistic you could find in a field like journalism where there's not really metrics, but so things like page views on articles, number of articles written, perceived value of like press hits that I'd done on television. What else? Like anything else I could find. And I, in fact, then wrote it up like a BuzzFeed listicle, top 10 list, like why you should give Jessica Bennett a raise. And I went in and I tried to express this, and naturally I was like stuttering and stumbling over my words and bright red, but then I followed up with the email. Yep. So I think it's important to be really data focused and data driven. I think it's important to know that women do struggle with this, and they're often penalized more so than men. But truly the way that we're going to make this equal is by continuing to ask. Yep. And I think that what companies can do as well is look at salary parity. I think Google is doing something around this, but comparing, is there a gap in your company between men and women? And if there is, solving for it.
Yeah, definitely. That's great advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
So your Feminist Fight Club is largely outside of work, but obviously made up of professional women. But inside of the workplace, would you recommend a Feminist Fight Club made up of colleagues? And what do you think are some of the strengths and some of the limitations of that sort of environment taking place at work?
Yeah, I mean, anyone can form a Feminist Fight Club. And there's a guide at the back of the book on how to do so, which basically is like, do whatever you want. And many people, in fact, have forms of feminist fight clubs. Like, we called ours that, and we also had a top secret name that I can't reveal. But, we thought it was important for our group to have a mix of women in creative industries, but not all in the same field, because we wanted to have a diversity of voices. And so we sort of handpicked based on that, but a lot of it was also random. Like, I ended up there through a mentor whose daughter was in it, and a lot of it just came organically. But I think that talking about these issues at work can be so important. Like, lean-in circles are now in companies all over the world, and I think it's been really effective to talk about them with colleagues. And so forming a Feminist Fight Club, basically, by being here, you are all members of the Feminist Fight Club. Welcome. Lifelong membership. There's no dues. You're in. But you can also form smaller groups. And I don't know, for me, having a group of women who I knew were unconditionally supportive and I could always turn to if I had a problem has truly helped me grow in many ways throughout my career and even my personal life. And I think there's no downside to it. I think that we need to help each other. The third rule of the new Feminist Fight Club is we fight patriarchy, not each other. So the idea of treating other women as allies, not as enemies. We don't need to be competitive. We are more powerful together. We can lift one another up.
One of the pieces, or one of the chapters that contained a ton of great advice was what would Josh do? Mm-hmm. And this was sort of advice to think like Josh, who's a male colleague with chutzpah, meaning, shameless audacity, not to be confused with utter bullshit. So I'm just wondering, first of all, how do you distinguish between those two?
Very hard.
Because I think, I struggled with that chapter because, some of the advice felt like, would I be going against what is sort of natural to me? And how much sort of do I need to work on that?
So yes, the chapter is called WWJD, what the other J, what would Josh do? Carry yourself with the confidence of a mediocre white man. And Josh, in fact, is a real person.
Harder than it sounds.
He's not named Josh, and he's a lovely individual and a good friend of mine. But we used to share a wall at Newsweek. We sat next to each other, and so I got to sort of observe him in all scenarios. And we had similar jobs, except that every time there was a meeting, I would be in my office with the door closed. This was back when people had offices. I'll never have an office again. Now I just work in my bed. But I would be studying up for a pitch meeting, determined to have every fact right, so nervous, being so prepared. And he would be in his office with his feet up on the desk, just ready to go in and bullshit his way through. And in his case, he was also very smart. So his bullshit was educated bullshit.
Yep.
But what the research shows is that actually we mistake sometimes confidence for competence.
Right.
And so the way that he was delivering it with such confidence was almost as effective as my really studied but unconfident pitches as well.
Yep.
And so it allowed me to observe him. And so throughout the chapter, I advise, asking yourself in various scenarios, WWJD or WWMD, what would a man do? Not so that women can start mimicking male behavior, but because we often underestimate ourselves. And so I know that for me, in a scenario where I was feeling nervous or wasn't sure how to go about something, I would ask myself, what would Josh do? And then I would end up somewhere in the middle. Josh would do this, I would naturally do this, I would end up here. And so often we underestimate ourselves, or we face imposter syndrome, or we don't feel like we deserve to be there or belong. And so a little bragging actually may get us to the point where we should be, where we're not underestimating our abilities and our accomplishments. So yeah, I proudly carry myself with the confidence of a mediocre white man.
I love it. So last question, you sort of described yourself as a cynic, but I'm holding out hope that you're still hopeful. And so I'm wondering, how do you remain hopeful and humorous and encouraged when digging into this research that's really sort of challenging to confront?
Right, and what's happening in the world?
Yeah.
Yes. So I try to have a sense of humor about it. If I couldn't laugh about some of this stuff, I think I would just be depressed.
Yeah.
So I still try to find humor in some of these things. Feminists, in fact, are really funny. We do have senses of humor. There's a joke, how many feminists does it take to screw in a light bulb? And then it's that's not funny. But actually it is funny, I think anyway. We can laugh about this stuff. It's serious, yes, it's serious, but we can laugh. And I also find a lot of hope in the younger generation.
Yep.
A lot of the women that I work with and talk to for stories and who help me on Feminist Fight Club social media are college women and college men. And the way that they talk about and think about these issues is so much further along than I was at their age. The way that they approach this intersectionally and the hope that they have. There's a study that came out recently about how Gen Z and younger millennials are actually much more hopeful than the rest of us. So look to the youth. The kids are all right. And so I go to them whenever I need a dose of bringing me up.
I love that. Thank you. So now I want to open it up to questions from the audience. And Lizzie has a microphone.
So we were just talking about this before. Every now and then something happens where a man does something that's well-intentioned but tone-deaf. So recently we got an email from some men inviting us to a mixer for women. I thought, why are the men inviting us to this? Why is there not a woman throwing the mixer, and why are the men even part of it? And so I asked my boss, this is pretty tone-deaf, and his response was, yes, but it was well-intentioned. How do you respond to that? Because I feel like a message should get to the men who sent it, but it was well-intentioned, and so why do we want to bring it up?
I mean, I would say that you have to call these things out. You don't have to be a bitch calling this stuff out, or be perceived as a bitch. it's important to talk about it. And so if it is tone deaf, then he should let them know. And so I don't know, it all, so much of this stuff is so individual. It depends on your power within the organization. Is this person your boss? Like, do you feel comfortable speaking up? And I always fall back on, if it's not just you, if it's a number of women part of that group who are asking for something to happen, then not any individual can be singled out. And so perhaps the response would be for multiple of you to go back and say, I totally understand, and I appreciate you passing this information along, or whatever it may be, because yeah, a lot of this is tone deafness, and we make mistakes, but no one's going to learn if they don't know that they're tone deaf. And so the message needs to make it back to those people.
I think my question is around the incidents that have sort of played out at Uber, which have become pretty well known, I think, especially here in Silicon Valley over the last few weeks. And I think obviously that was an extreme case that the writer sort of talked about in her article on Medium. But I think for a lot of us that work in Silicon Valley as women, we're like, of course, these subtle daily acts of sexism happen every day. Like, why is this so surprising to people? But I think one thing that made me start thinking was one of the follow-up articles was talking about how Uber's performance system is a bell curve and how they have 5 performance buckets, and it sort of encourages people to undercut their teammates, or because of things like imposter syndrome, it encourages the men to shine and the women not to shine. And then, I think that their performance system is probably directly modeled after Google's, or it's very, very similar from what it sounds like. So my question to you is, like, have you read anything about that, or have you thought about that, or do you have any sort of data, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited to, but data that sort of supports this idea of like performance and the best ways to measure that so it's not a systemic problem for men versus women succeeding in a company?
Right. Well, I think that one very important thing is setting really clear criteria for success. So Leanan and McKinsey put out this study every year of women in the workplace. And this past one, they found that something like 78% of companies said that they support gender equality. Or it was the employees saying that they believe their CEOs really supported gender equality. And yet, like 50% of the managers in those companies didn't actually know what to do. And then only 38% of those companies actually set clear criteria for things like hiring. And what we know is that, at least as it pertains to hiring, but I imagine it pertains to performance reviews as well, women are often judged based on their past performance, and men are judged based on their potential. So literally, like, we have to have a line item on our resume, and looking at a man, you're like, well, he could do it. Like, I can see him as a future leader. And oftentimes the people seeing those people as future leaders are also men. And so, the reality is it's sometimes easier to see someone who looks like you rise up. So what can you do? Well, if you have very clear criteria and you know that that's existing, then you can set metrics for it, and you can make sure that you're not hiring or reviewing based on what you think a person's potential may be. I don't know specifically what companies have done to try to, solve for that bell curve, but I have to think that having more women in leadership to talk about these things, it's like the same reason why we were talking about earlier, our microphones don't clip onto the back of a dress, because they were made by men and they were made for men. And so you see this across the board in small things and large things. And if women are involved in the decision-making process about how people are judged, or about how, whatever this may be in this case, then I think that they can elevate some of these issues. So that's not a perfect solution on how to do it, but I think like all of this stuff is so interconnected. And until half of the leaders are women, like we will continue to have these problems. But I also think it's important that people are speaking out and talking about it. Like that woman writing that piece that went completely viral has sparked a conversation that, yes, I totally agree. Many of us were like, yeah, duh. Like obviously this is happening. We know this. But it appears that a lot of people didn't know it, and it's getting mainstream press attention now, which is a good thing. And it was obviously under scrutiny to change some of its policies. And so I think that, or I hope that we'll see a ripple effect there. But oftentimes it does take someone speaking out and going out on a limb, which is where I go back to power in numbers. Like, she wasn't working at the company anymore, so she felt comfortable speaking out. But for those who are inside, sometimes it helps to band together and approach it as a group, because you can't be penalized, you're more powerful, and if you're experiencing something, probably someone else is too.
Any resources to share about language to push back on disempowering praise? I recently got "She's a Smart Cookie" on a project I'm leading. I have a PhD in neuroscience and 8 years of industry experience.
Oh my God.
I am not a cookie, I am an expert. Any advice?
Call it out. Like, you're not, I call that the undermine her. The person who's like, great job, kiddo, or thank you, honey, or cookie, like all of those little language pieces that are so tiny, but they're so undermining. Like, if you're standing there and your team sees you being called a cookie by some other leader, like, are they going to respect you? So I think calling it out, sometimes you may have to take that person aside and be like, hey, we're all in this for the same thing. I think it actually benefits you for our team to see me as a leader. And when you call me cookie, it undermines my authority. Mm-hmm. So calling out the behavior. And, I think that we're being more cognizant these days of speech patterns. So, from things like that to the way that so much of our language is gendered. Like, I've started trying to find an alternative when I say you guys. But even things like there's a dictionary in the book, an A to Z, it's a how not to be a dictionary, an A to Z guide to non-sexist language, but like things that I had never realized, like the word seminal. It comes from semen. Like, that is a male-derived term, and that is what we use to describe great works.
Right.
And so their stuff is so ingrained into every tiny bit of our culture, and sometimes it's a matter of calling it out when we see it, because people do not even realize it.
Yep.
And for what it's worth, like, would you call a man cookie? No. Like, you can pretty much apply that question to anything. Like, would I view her as bossy if she were a man? Probably not. So asking that question as well.
Trying to formulate this question. I guess this is about any lessons learned from male allies. And I guess I'm seeing this through the lens of anxiety. Anxiety is important because it pushes people to change, but it can also prompt a backlash. And I like the language that you used about, hey, I'm actually trying to be helpful to us. So just any thoughts that you have, again, like things that you feel like have been successful in sort of recruiting allies or getting mind shift in allies to see common cause, anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just talking more openly is really step one, because I think we're hesitant to talk about these issues and we're fearful that we're going to screw up. And I wrote a whole book that has language like mansplaining and mantruption and bropropriation everywhere. And on some level, that can make men feel targeted. I'm also trying to use it as a way to have humor to open up some of these issues. But I think we have to get over our fears about talking about it and just discuss more openly so that the stigma goes away.
Yeah, just sort of a follow-up thought to that is, basically, I have this notion of sort of lowering the cost for screwing up. I mean, I guess it's proportional to the screw up. Like, in some ways, we'd have to raise the cost. But for those, like maybe microaggressions should have a micro price. And it's basically like, look, like, I appreciate that we're all working together, and like making it less like, I read an article that was like basically implicit bias is the new way to say that you're a racist. And the person was just like, I'm not a racist. And it's like, no, oh my God, it's the exact opposite. It's trying to say we all, because of us as primates, we have these cognitive shortcuts. It's meant to, to say, look, you're in good company, but it's having kind of the opposite effect.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to talk about the ways that I've screwed up frequently as a way to let my audience or whomever it may be know that, like, if I'm doing it too, then we're all doing it, and it's okay. And so maybe one way to approach it, at least when trying to get other people on your side, is by beginning with something that you've done that you realized. And then maybe they won't feel attacked. I mean, so it's like, we shouldn't have to dance around this issue and walk on eggshells, but the reality is that like we work in office environments and we want to be respectful and we don't want people to feel attacked or offended. And I think that the reality is that most men really do want to help and they want to be allies, and I believe that, but it's backed in all sorts of data, and especially young men, like they want gender equality, they want equal relationships, but this is like, for hundreds and hundreds of years, men have run shit. And so there is a learning curve. Like it does take some time to overcome some of these issues. So yeah, I think talking about a way that you've experienced it is one way, and talking about things in groups so that one person doesn't feel attacked. But also just knowing that like sometimes uncomfortable stuff is gonna come up, but we can still have productive conversations about it.
Yeah, I have just a couple of questions that I'll try to keep short. What do we do about the fact that the F word of feminism turns some people off immediately? And how do we get those people back into the conversation, hopefully? And about...
I'll do that one first. So I really do think that the stigma around the word feminism is changing. I think that celebrities have had a lot to do with this, in fact, like seeing Beyonce on stage at the VMAs defining the word. That's like bigger than any other feminist could ever accomplish. So I think that the stigma is going away. I also think that continuing to talk about what the definition of feminism actually is, it means that it's a person that believes in gender equality between the sexes. And that's like the most benign thing ever. Like, who's gonna say they're anti that? So I think that it's going away. I also think of the belief that like, if you don't wanna call yourself a feminist, but you believe in these things and you're going to fight for them, like fine, that's better than nothing. Yeah. And so whether you call yourself a feminist or not, I think it's about working towards equality. And for what it's worth, like when I was pitching this book in the beginning, which was a couple of years ago, I said to my male agent, do you think we should call this Lady Fight Club? Because people are gonna be so offended by the word feminist. And you know, I'm coming from a mainstream news background. I didn't wanna go with a niche feminist press. I wanted this book to reach the masses. And he, to his credit, was like, no, feminist is a stronger title. We're gonna go out with that. And so we did, and I was sort of wary. I was nervous about what would happen. And to my surprise, you know, we had bids from a dozen different mainstream publishers, not niche feminist presses. And so that to me was very encouraging. And I think that was still 2 years ago. I think that the word has become more mainstream since then. But there will always be arguments about the word feminism. Like for so long this has occurred, and I don't know, every decade or so there's like a conversation around, should we rebrand feminism? Like, should we call it something else? And I don't think that's gonna happen, but you know, if you're willing to wear the title proudly, I say like, do it loud.
And then just around intersectionality, I feel like I'm often fearful that I've heard people in other minority groups who are also women complain that they feel like their voices are not heard. What advice do you have for white women or anyone who wants to make sure that they're supporting and raising up those voices rather than potentially accidentally talking over them or shutting them out of the conversation?
I think, like, first of all, try not to be defensive, because I see this happen online so much where, like, white women are called out for some of their behavior, and probably much in the same way that men feel attacked at work, the immediate response is, like, defensiveness. And I think that we need to listen more. Like, we need to listen more. We need to respect that these voices have been marginalized for years and years and years. So even if we may not think in a particular moment that we are drowning them out, like, we have long had a voice, not as much of a voice as men, but a voice. And there was a really long history of racism in the women's movement. And so I think, yeah, we have to like be okay with screwing up and be okay with being called out for it, and like try to correct the behavior and move on, I think.
You sort of addressed this, but let's go directly to it again. One of the senior leaders on my team has recently received a bit of flack for using guys too often as a blanket term when addressing a mixed gender group. It doesn't bother me, yet when someone uses ladies to email only admins, it does. What's your take on sensitivities like that?
I think we need to just right here, right now, come up with a better term for guys. Like, y'all feels weird to me. Folks. Okay. Yes. So maybe we have solved this right here. Thank you. Yes. Thank you to the unicorn in the room. One of two. You all. Yeah. I mean. True. Who would have thought the South would be so progressive? Yeah, I think that this stuff is like so entrenched in our language, and yeah.
All of you also. I need all of you to focus on this.
Yeah.
What are I don't know.
Yeah, I need to get more comfortable with folks.
Yeah.
Yeah, or we come up with a new word.
Humans.
Even human. Human. Basically, all language is sexist if you really get down to it.
About a year ago, I had an incident with a friend, like a good friend, who was talking about the efforts going on for hiring diverse people. This is a very respectful person that I'm on good terms with, but he said, that to use his words, and I still remember this, the pendulum has swung too far, and people are being hurt by these efforts. Basically good people are not being hired because something good, we're looking for diverse candidates, implying the woman thing. And I don't know, I didn't know how to respond at the time, which was going to be not, I didn't want to say blah 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 feminism blah.
That's what I wanted.
I did want to say that. I wanted to say that, but I also it's not gonna solve the problem, and I don't know how to address it. Advice, please.
Yeah, and I feel free to chime in if anyone else has advice too. Well, as you were saying that, I wanted to do rah feminism things for the record. I mean, it's tricky. It's welcome to history where these people have been marginalized and not hired for years and years and years, and we have to correct for that somehow. But I think that also, I don't know, throwing the numbers back in that person's face, probably they're referencing a team or a company that is still a majority white male, even if this person feels that the pendulum has swung too far. And then potentially making note of the fact that actually it's better for the company to have a more diverse team, and listing off all those stats about how teams with more diversity are more collaborative and more successful, and companies with more women on the board have higher returns. And even things in a room, in a meeting where there are at least 25% women, which is what social science calls the point of critical mass, then those women in the room will A, feel more comfortable speaking up, and B, what they are saying will actually be heard more. It's sort of this point where we stop viewing that 25% as a minority group or as speaking on behalf of women or on behalf of their race, and just view them as experts who are in the room. So that's not a perfect answer, but trying to remind that person. Does anyone else want to chime in with their thoughts?
So moving on to kind of a different note, you brought up imposter syndrome, which I think a lot of people in this room can identify with, myself included. You know that you're good at your job. Logically, you understand that you do a good job every day, and an email comes in on Friday afternoon with your manager asking to meet with you, and you panic, right? Because you're I'm totally in trouble. There's no doubt.
I suck.
And
I'm
then
fired.
I'm totally getting fired.
You should
right?
fire me. In fact, I'll just quit.
Right, exactly. Maybe I'll just quit on Friday afternoon so I don't
Escalate.
have to have anxiety all weekend about it. What are your tips for dealing with that and trying to kind of deal with the internalized sense of I'm a failure, or I'm going to be a failure, or I should be a failure, right?
Right. I think first, knowing that you are not the only one to feel this way. Imposter syndrome, this sense that you don't belong, that you don't deserve to be there, that you're not good at your job, this disproportionately, statistically affects women and minorities. So LGBT, racial minorities. And oftentimes it's because those groups of people have this added pressure of accomplishing firsts or needing to not fuck up because they'll be judged on behalf of their gender or their race if they do. So first off, knowing that like literally I power pose before I go on stage and I was speaking at a law firm on Monday and it was a paid gig and I was like, why are these people paying me? Like I should pay them. Like I can't believe. And it was like a well-paid, and I was like, I don't deserve this much. So we all experience it, so you're not alone. Second, you can try to trick your brain, and this has been found to be effective, so that instead of focusing on how you feel, you focus on the issue of imposter syndrome. Like, it's not me, it's the imposter syndrome talking. And literally, like saying that in the mirror has been proven to be effective in trying to overcome it because it makes it an issue, not your issue. I also think that having friends and allies and members of your Feminist Fight Club or whomever it is to remind you that like you're not getting fired, you don't suck, it's gonna be okay. Like I know that you're good at what you do can, be like the voice that you need inside your head to support you. There's other things you can do too, like power posing, or there's a list of them in the book, but I think that like remembering that, Sheryl Sandberg says she felt like a fraud, and Meryl Streep, the woman with the most Oscars, has said that every time she wins an award, she thinks they must have made a mistake. And so it's all of us, and even some of the world's most famous and successful people.
Thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you, Jessica.